An underground compound that symbolizes the terrors of the Cold War.
To even get an idea of the immensity of this place, you really have to get down there. It'll blow your mind.
A pioneering complex that played a central role in a famous World War II plot.
It's rare to be sad about a death averted, but in this case, I think we can be.
A remote and desolate landscape with a mysterious history.
As they started digging away, they found bodies that showed evidence that they'd been murdered.
And ruins on a beautiful Caribbean island that speak of a turbulent past.
This is the center of a struggle over something worth a great deal.
Decaying relics, ruins of lost worlds, forged by years of toil, but now haunted by the past. Their amazing secrets are now waiting to be revealed. In a remote part of Washington State in the USA, miles from the nearest town, lies an extraordinary secret site.
The area now is desolate, with barren land and a junkyard all around with rusting buses and old metalwork.
There aren't a lot of people. There's not a lot going on. So if you wanted to hide something, it would be a good place to do it.
You have some bare farmland far from anything. There are these large concrete pads. There are these structures in the ground that you can't quite place.
Something here is a bit different. Large iron doorways leading down staircases. Something else clearly once happened here. The site gives very little indication of what it is that's underground. To find out, you have to investigate.
To do that, you have to go very deep underground.
This is clearly a highly engineered structure. And the fact that they put so much underground indicated they must have had a really good reason not to just build a building on the surface.
It's completely dark underground, with rusted tunnels leading off into the darkness, giving the impression that the site is far larger than the human eye can see.
If you want to actually find out what's there, you need somebody to get their scuba suit on and go on in.
With so much water in the tunnels, it begs the question whether this was the cause of the end of operations at this site.
Scuba diver Jim Brockus has spent many years exploring this intriguing place.
So if you're looking for clues to what this site and this area actually was, you really don't have to look any farther for the biggest clue because I'm standing on it. These are actually two very large doors. They weigh 125 tons for each half. So you imagine the size of these doors, what it would take to lift them up. This structure is something enormous. The engineering that was behind all of it and the capabilities to build something out in this remote area of this magnitude, it just makes your mind spin of what could this possibly be.
So why put all this engineering in the middle of nowhere? The answer lies in the Cold War politics of the 1950s, when the United States and the Soviet Union seemed to be on the brink of a nuclear war.
The threat of the Cold War was real and very frightening. America had never been in this position before, with the spectre of annihilation seemingly round every corner.
The logic of nuclear weapons is absolutely terrifying. There was this crazy logic called mutually assured destruction, MAD, that meant that the only way to really be safe was to convince your opponent that even if they hit you first, you could still strike back and wipe them off the map.
The US needed a weapons program that would act as a deterrent against Soviet aggression. And with Soviet ground forces growing in numbers along the border region of Western Europe, time was running out.
Once the Soviets acquire nuclear weapons, deterrence for the West is absolutely central because the Western forces are vastly outnumbered.
Their answer was to build a weapon that had the power to destroy an entire nation: the Titan missile.
These rockets were state-of-the-art technology of the sort that NASA was using. They had a range of 6,000 miles and reached speeds of up to 25 times the speed of sound by the time the engines cut out.
But to be able to strike back, you would first need to survive an initial attack. That was the purpose of this hidden facility: the Larsen Air Base Titan I missile silo.
Well, right now we're about 40 feet underground. To even get an idea of the immensity of this place, you really have to get down there and see the size of those launch tubes and the other supporting structures that are down there. It'll blow your mind.
Today, much of the facility lies underwater.
When you get to the launcher, you'll be on the service elevator, and the service elevator is permanently stuck at the top end of the missile, which is where it was frozen into place from the water and lack of service. And that's where you step off of when you begin the dive. And that's really where you see the enormity of the launch tubes themselves. You look overhead and you see those launch doors are closed, 125 tons apiece.
The site has 3 of these silos.
The 3 silos were all linked by tunnels, containing living quarters, a medical center, and most crucially, a command and control center. And these were all centered around the missiles to maximize the speed with which they could be got ready and fired.
So we're in the control room. This is definitely the heart of the facility. The control systems in this room controlled the fueling, the liquid oxygen, the rocket propellant, the whole launch sequence, the raising of the antennas, because those also had to be done, and the initialization of the countdown, which we have to remember took 15 minutes from the time that they hit the go button.
The men with the controls at their fingertips had the power to unleash a nuclear holocaust. One tiny mistake would have had catastrophic consequences.
There would always be probably 6 people in here. They were very isolated, very lonely, I'm sure, but they probably were a real close group with the other 4 or 6 guys that were here. I mean, they were family, but at the same time, they were going to take it very serious, but they knew if they were called into service, it might be the last service they ever do.
The base was on high alert, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It was just one of hundreds of similar sites across the country.
Titan wasn't the only program the Americans were running. Simultaneously, they were also developing the Atlas program, and this was an indication of just how desperate they were to make sure they had the best technology at any given moment.
But why go to all the effort to bury these missiles so far underground?
You put missiles deep in the ground with massive armored covers and concrete around them, and unless you score a direct hit on that complex, that is going to survive. And if it survives a nuclear strike, then you can fire your retaliation.
That's what they were gambling on, that enough missiles would survive an attack that we could then open up the silos and launch back.
However, putting everything underground caused some serious problems.
One key danger was that the groundwater level at the site was high, and the water had to be pumped continuously to keep it out of the system. Technologically, it's a simple problem to solve, but looking around at the flooding today, it's clear quite how catastrophic it could have been if it had gone wrong.
Water was not the only danger the silos faced. Storing hundreds of tons of highly flammable rocket fuel was also fraught with risk.
Fueling the missile is a very complex process, and it's very, very dangerous. And if you make the slightest mistake, it can be very, very fatal.
Fortunately for us all, the missiles here were never launched. In fact, it was only active for 3 years before it was abandoned. But why?
This period with the Titan missiles didn't last that long. Ultimately, they designed better missiles, more reliable, that didn't require these dangerous liquid fuels. So the program was actually being phased out by 1965.
Today, the site is abandoned and alone. But its Cold War history is a valuable reminder of the reasons it was built.
Looking back, it seems so insane. We spent hundreds of billions of dollars on these missiles in holes in the ground. The Soviets pretty much wrecked their economy trying to keep up and building their own missiles. And yet, in a perverse way, it worked in the sense that we never had a major war, either nuclear or non-nuclear, during that entire period of the Cold War.
South of Germany's capital, Berlin, is a former celebrity hangout and the birthplace of a deadly plan that nearly changed the course of human history.
You come upon this site and it's surrounded by farmland, fields. There's some broken tarmac around it. It's got these big cavernous buildings.
The design is clearly meant to incorporate all of the most modern materials of mid-20th century technology.
This has to have some kind of important purpose.
Here we have a building that has got very few internal supports, very high roof, thin walls. The building is designed so that you can build very big things inside.
There are some things here that don't quite add up. What explains the mysterious graffiti inside?
Inside, they're defaced with all kinds of graffiti in multiple languages, especially Russian. And that, of course, begs the question, why are these buildings in the heart of Germany filled with Russian graffiti?
The 1930s saw the dawn of a new era of human achievement. It was a time when the skies were, quite literally, the limit.
In the 1930s is really the golden age of flight.
At this time, pilots were celebrities. They were adventurers of the sky.
You've got Charles Lindbergh making the transatlantic flight in the Spirit of St. Louis in 1927. Then in the early 30s, you've got the flights of Amelia Earhart and Italo Balbo. And we're seeing European and American flyers crossing the Atlantic, expanding the boundaries of flight more and more and more.
The heart of all this was here, at Rangsdorf. It was originally home to the Bucher aeroplane manufacturers, who were renowned around the world for building and testing sports planes. Knut Henschel is a historian at the site.
Rangsdorf was very popular among the pilots. Many famous people trained at the flight school in Rangsdorf. Even the famous ocean pilot Charles Lindbergh visited.
So this is a place that's not far from Berlin. And in the early 20th century, the most exciting thing you could do is learn how to fly a plane. And people with money would come from Berlin, and they would get their flying lessons here.
But the onset of war in 1939 changed all that, as events began to take a more sinister turn.
The Germans were banned by the Treaty of Versailles from having any offensive weapons. So they weren't allowed to have heavy artillery, they weren't allowed to have tanks, they weren't allowed to have submarines, they weren't allowed to have big battleships, and they weren't allowed to have aircraft.
So the German government encourages private individuals to join flying clubs and learn how to fly. And the German government encourages companies to build private planes for people who want to learn how to fly.
And they would have these sport airports like Rangsdorf, where flyers could practice flying and say they were doing it for sport, not for military use. But meanwhile, this was basically the seeds of the Luftwaffe.
Rangsdorf was at the very heart of the subterfuge. A visitor today would note that it looks very different to a modern airport in one key respect.
Unlike today, when every airport has one or more runways made of concrete, planes started and landed on grass. At that time, the engines were quite weak, so they always had to start against the wind. The round shape of the airfield allowed planes to take off in every direction, wherever the wind came from.
Once war broke out, there was no longer any need for the cloak and dagger approach. Along with most of industrial Germany, Rangsdorf was commandeered for the Nazi war effort. Inside these hangars, it was now military planes that were being built, and not civilian aircraft.
We're standing here in front of the so-called special building. This building was built especially for war production.
The aircraft parts that the Germans built at the Rangsdorf Airfield using foreign prisoners of war were for some of the most important planes in the German arsenal, like the Stuka dive bomber, like the Focke-Wulf fighter.
We're in the final assembly hall, where planes were assembled. The aircrafts stood very close together, side by side. The engines were installed, the wings were mounted, and finally, the aircraft were weighed. Here you can see the remnants of the aircraft scale, where the center of gravity was measured. After they were done with the measurements, the big hall gates were pushed open, and the planes were driven out to the field.
The parts and planes made here were vital for the German war machine. So it's ironic that a place so crucial to the rise of Hitler was to play an important part in the famous plot to kill him.
The airport really cemented its place in history in July 20th, 1944, when a high-ranking officer named Klaus von Stauffenberg boarded an aircraft to fly to Hitler's high command post for an important meeting. He carried with him a briefcase with 2 bombs.
Von Stauffenberg was one of the leading members of a plot to kill Adolf Hitler and remove the Nazi Party from power. The D-Day landings had convinced the plotters that the war was lost and that only the death of the Führer, followed by an immediate armistice, could save Germany from total ruin. As early as 1943, von Stauffenberg had written a list of demands to which the Allies would have to agree for an armistice to happen. It's hard to imagine them doing so, but the plot gathered pace anyway, driven on by von Stauffenberg.
When he arrived at the meeting, he found an excuse to go off to the toilet. He armed the bomb. He came back and put it in position.
And And Stauffenberg leaves Hitler's bunker in Rastenburg, hears the explosion, assumes that Hitler's going to be dead because he'd placed this briefcase bomb essentially at Hitler's feet under the table.
Unfortunately for von Stauffenberg, the briefcase and bomb were moved behind a heavy table leg, which took most of the force of the blast. Hitler was wounded, but he survived. The July plot had failed.
We still have the original flight order, documenting his return flight. Stauffenberg landed in Rangsdorf, probably not knowing that the assassination attempt had failed.
Eventually, Stauffenberg and all the other plotters are rounded up and brutally executed. Some shot, some tortured, interrogated, and then hung on meat hooks to die slow deaths. And Hitler watches the videos of those executions.
The war dragged on for a further bloody year, and eventually Rangsdorf would have new occupiers. But who were they?
The place was vacated in late April 1945. The next day, the Soviet army took over this airfield and also flew their attacks on Berlin.
The Soviets were great at taking over infrastructure and putting it to new use. So they took over the manufacturing facilities and used it to build engines, and specifically jet engines. They built helicopter pads so they could use it as a base for helicopter operations, and they occupied the airport for many years.
Following the reunification of Germany in 1990, the Soviets left Rangsdorf for good, and the airfield was left to decay. Today, Rangsdorf stands empty and forgotten, but its important place in 20th century history is assured.
We look at a lot of Nazi sites, and we see a lot of darkness and evil and despair. And it really means something when we look at this airfield to think about the small number of people who had the moral courage to put their lives on the line to stop the darkness.
Deep in a remote corner of Colorado, USA, is a remarkable landscape that was for decades forgotten and unexplored.
The environment's a really remarkable topographical feast. You've got these plunging canyons and valleys. You've got flat top hills everywhere. It's a visual feast.
The high desert of western Colorado is a beautiful landscape. It's a land of cliffs, narrow spaces, mysteries. You could hide away in here for a long time and not be found.
And it seems someone wanted to do exactly that. Because hidden away deep in the rocks are some fascinating remains.
What's unique about this site is if you were walking along and you didn't happen to glance up, you might miss it.
This is an area that holds a lot of history, but it's not always visible on the surface.
You could walk up and down the valley for many, many days and weeks and not even notice these villages.
And the remains here are not isolated or dotted around. They are everywhere.
They go on and on and on. It's not just a few small dwellings. It's actually, you know, a sort of town, almost like a city in the cliffs.
They're truly awe-inspiring, not only because of where they are, that they're on rock face, that they're high up, but the sheer size of them.
There are little cliff dwellings tucked in almost everywhere, very hard to see in some cases, far off the ground, incredibly remote and inaccessible.
So why are they here? And from what dangers were those that built them hiding? In the late 19th century, a group of men made an amazing discovery.
So I have something pretty incredible to show you, but first we have to get up to the top of the ladder.
Christy Brown is a guide at the site. She has spent 15 years studying the ruins and learning more about the people that built them.
So we just climbed 32 feet up this ladder, but we're hundreds of feet above the canyon bottom, and we're about to go into balcony house.
The men who discovered the site stumbled upon it by complete accident.
The first, people that we really credit with discovering these sites were the Wetherells. They were a ranching family out of Mancos, and they started recognizing, what they were seeing as dark shapes on the cliffside was actually a cliff dwelling.
Can you imagine what it was like to scramble up here and walk into these ancient homes and realize you might be the first person to set foot in here since the original inhabitants left?
In fact, the group had accidentally discovered one of the most important ancient sites in North America, Mesa Verde.
After its discovery, you could imagine, as an archaeologist, this would be an absolute playground. So there was a lot to be uncovered, and as they started digging away, they found more and more and more.
So just like any true curiosity, the more we learn and the more the early archaeologists learned about what was going on here, the more questions they had.
The mysteries were many. But there are clues in the buildings that help identify who these people were and when the buildings were constructed.
So we look at the openings of these sites and we think that they're windows because they're so small. But in actuality, they're doorways. And that helps us understand how tall these people were in stature. And we look back in history and we can start dating when these people might have been around this area.
Once archaeologists really began to investigate these cliff dwellings, they realized this was an era of Native American life that we didn't know anything about. And it predated all of the tribes and peoples that were in that region when the first people of European descent started to come into that area.
The archaeologists discovered that this was home to a civilization called the ancestral Puebloans. The culture spanned the present-day four corners of the USA. There's still some debate about when the ancestral Puebloans emerged as a distinct culture, but the latest research places it around the 12th century BC. They were, it seems, remarkable people.
The ancestral Puebloans had to have been very skilled, not only in terms of making baskets, making pottery, making things that would sort of help serve everyday life. They engineered this space, and it's something to really marvel at.
Numerous discoveries were made, but the most fascinating was that the 800-year-old cliff dwellings were only the beginning.
This was just a small piece of a bigger part of a huge puzzle.
The archaeologists have unearthed some 4,700 sites over tens of thousands of square miles that these people have made a success over many, many years living in this area.
Curiously, these precariously placed sites were not their first homes.
So although the cliff dwellings were some of the first sites to be discovered, the archaeologists realized that the history of these people went back much, much farther. What we're seeing here is one of those dwellings that they were living in before they were in the cliff dwellings. This Pueblo-style construction allowed them to be closer to their crops and at the same time allowed them to take advantage of habitation for their expanding population.
The ancestral Puebloans thrived on these mesa tops. At its height, there were perhaps 30,000 people living in the area. They developed roads, built sun temples, constructed reservoirs, and farmed the land.
The ancestral Puebloan people were able to command around 40,000 square miles of land. This puts them on par with the sort of most important ancient civilizations in the Americas. And so they're incredibly significant. They were able to establish an empire, if you will.
But then something changed, and it appears that they decided to give up all they had on the mesa tops and migrate from the flats to the cliff enclaves below.
One has to wonder why it is that a culture that was doing so well on the mesa tops moved into these cliff dwellings, and then the mystery deepens whenever you realize that they were only here for a short period of time, and then they left.
Whatever drove these people from their open villages and their mesa-top farms into these remote, dangerous, difficult cliff dwellings, it must have been a powerful force.
You have to wonder whether there were ecological concerns or whether they were trying to find more secure dwellings. They might have been at war with other indigenous people. And so there are all sorts of things that are kind of hard to know.
There must have been something that was so terrifying that they would take these risks of dragging their families, their babies, up these cliff faces to live in these tiny, cramped little rooms. But whatever it was that they were fleeing from made it worth it.
But time was running out. What caused the civilization's final demise?
Because the civilization is so undocumented and there's no written language associated with it in terms of archaeological finds, there's no real way of fully understanding the great extent of this civilization. What was its final demise, we'll probably never know.
For decades, historians and archaeologists have searched for the reasons behind the fall of this great ancient civilization. The site seems to have been populated for a mere 100 years, and a grim discovery suggests it may have had a violent end.
They found bodies that showed evidence that they'd been murdered. And so that led people to start thinking, well, certainly something's happening in terms of a conflict. Now, whether that's internal or external, we can postulate.
Although there's a lot of theories about why these people left, whether it was conflict with groups of people coming in, whether it was just societal changes in general, whether it was a drought or a change in climate, we really don't have a good answer as to why they left.
Whatever the reasons, these haunting ruins still stand as an astonishing legacy to the vanished people that built them.
When you look at these beautiful cliff dwellings, you look at the effort that went into them, you look at all the engineering work and brilliance, and then you realize they were only here for a heartbeat, you know, maybe 2 generations. So it's a tragedy.
On the paradise island of Saint Lucia in the Caribbean, there are ruins that echo a dark period in the island's history.
It's a tropical paradise with these brilliant beaches, and you see these crumbling European buildings.
There's another structure here which looks like it dates to the late 19th century. Clearly, this site was going to see a lot of different uses.
It was obviously in use for a good long time and was worth a great deal of investment. And now it is absolutely going to pieces.
Why were these buildings constructed on such a remote tropical island so long ago?
This place is clearly very, very important. This is the center of a struggle over something worth a great deal.
It's hard to believe that an area so idyllic can be a site for so much violence and conflict.
What did Saint Lucia have to offer that saw it become one of the most fought-over islands in the world? The Caribbean, with its fertile soil and warm climate, is the perfect place to grow crops like sugar, which were in high demand in 18th century Europe.
Sugar islands in the Caribbean meant money for the home country. Every country in Europe wanted to have a sugar island or two.
But there was another important feature on the island. It was Castries Harbor.
The Deepwater Harbor, that's the real value of the place. It has tremendous strategic importance.
France and Great Britain, the two superpowers of the period, fought over the island time and again. The conflict began with two failed British attempts to colonize the island in the early 17th century. Within a few years, the French had arrived and purchased it for the West India Company. The British, of course, were not best pleased, and plans were laid to invade the island. The first of these attacks came in 1778, and the scene was set for a series of prolonged and very bitter battles. These ruined fortifications bear mute witness to that struggle. Dr. Gregor Williams is an expert on the island defenses.
We're walking towards the Half Moon Battery, which was built by the French when they started serious fortifications in Saint Lucia. And each of these would have been an 8-inch cannon. The French then, with those cannons, would be defending the entrance to the harbor from the British ships that would have wanted to go in.
In St. Lucia, they talk about 7 times French, 7 times British, meaning they passed from French to British control 7 times as these great powers fought for control of this island.
After years of bloodshed, the fighting between the French and British eventually came to an end, and the military structures that dotted the island were abandoned. And that was the way they stayed until the outbreak of World War II in 1939.
When the war started, these buildings had been unoccupied. They were sitting here doing nothing. So the British engaged these buildings to house soldiers of the Second World War.
The Caribbean becomes a vital front during World War II because you think about the Allies in Europe, the Red Army, the US Army, the British Army, they were all basically supplied with oil from the United States. And so all this oil transited through the Gulf of Mexico, through the Caribbean in tankers headed for Europe.
The German Kriegsmarine spotted an opportunity to choke off these essential supplies.
The Germans are trying to use very efficient weapons, small warships and submarines, to sink as much Britain-bound commerce, including American ships, as they possibly can.
But the main threat to merchant shipping came in the shape of the deadly German U-boat.
It's sort of cat and mouse stuff as the Allies are hunting these German U-boats, and the German U-boats are trying to dart into inlets and coves, trying to resupply themselves and avoid detection by the Allied destroyers.
Every port in North America, the Caribbean, was filled with people nervously scanning the sea for periscopes.
So new fortifications were constructed to play their part in the fight against the Nazi war machine.
We're on Meadows Battery. First of all, there was an old French fortification there. Then the British came in, and then they established this during the Second World War, when they were fighting against the Germans.
Another thing that these structures tell us is the immense scale of the Second World War and how it really touched every corner of the globe. No place was spared from it.
On the 9th of March, 1942, a very young Michael Shasta saw the island fortifications swing into action once more.
In the hours of 9 and midnight, we heard this very loud explosion. So we were immediately awoken, and we looked out of the veranda, and we saw a number of people, and when they were questioned, they said that we were under attack. There was a lot of pandemonium.
The Meadow battery spat out machine gun fire into the dark waters, but it was hopeless. A U-boat had managed to get into the great deep water harbor of Castries. The results were devastating.
The German U-boat U-161 sneaks silently into the harbor, fires its torpedoes, and sinks 2 massive British freighters that are anchored there. An 8,000-ton freighter, a 5,000-ton freighter, both sink very quickly with great loss of life.
The German U-boats actually came in from this end. Yeah, they came up quite quickly. It's not a long harbor. They knew we were ill-prepared.
The Saint Lucia policeman, the constable who is looking down at the harbor from these old fortifications with his creaky Nordenfeld machine gun, is able to bring the U-boat under fire and able to force it back out of the harbor.
Fortunately, U-boat 161 was the last to invade the island. After the war, the military structures that had dominated Castries for so long were finally abandoned. Today, they are still silent, but they remind all who see them of a peaceful, beautiful island's turbulent past.
When you go to Castries today, you see one of the propellers from one of these freighters, which is still displayed as a kind of memorial. You're reminded this was a place that was brutally contested by the great powers because of its economic and strategic importance.
The Second World War is not just a story of the big countries and the big battles. Here, it is a story that is as intimate as a small island's own harbor.
Now they are abandoned, crumbling ruins. Many remind us of dark times, but some were once beacons of hope and progress, lasting testimonies to human imagination, enterprise, and spirit.